All right. So this morning I'd like to preach from a very familiar parable. I would say arguably it is probably the most familiar parable among the saved and the unsaved alike. Probably I would say that the second most familiar parable is the prodigal son, and the most familiar parable is probably the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is one that's common in our culture. They have a general understanding of what it means. And we even have laws that are called Good Samaritan laws. So it's affected our culture all around. So we're going to start by turning to Luke chapter 10 and verse 25. Luke chapter 10 and verse 25. We're going to read the whole exchange and the parable, and then I'm going to give you some historical context and interpretation as well. So Luke chapter 10 and verse 25. Let's get started. Verse 25, "And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said unto him, What is written in the law? How readest thou? And he answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right. This do, and thou shalt live. But he, willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, And who is my neighbor? And Jesus answering said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment, and wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite was at the place, and he looked on him, and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him, and bound up his wounds, pouring oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow he departed. He took out 2 pence, and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. Which now of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves? And he said, He that showed mercy on him. Then the Lord said unto him, Go, and do thou likewise. So, last week I was struggling a little bit to pick a subject matter to teach on. I have different messages prepared, and sometimes I have a hard time deciding which one I'm going to teach on. And sometimes they just don't hit me, like that's the one you need to focus on. And so I was talking to my father about it, and he said, preach on what you know. Do a lesson on apologetics. And I said, I thought to myself, I really don't want to do that. I'm about to spend an entire trimester talking about that. So I was hesitant. And then that evening, in my own reading and the following day, I kept coming across references to the Good Samaritan. And I had some material prepared for the Good Samaritan, but it was very roughly done. It wasn't anything that I was ready to preach on. And I also thought, man, we've heard so many messages on the Good Samaritan, like not just here, but just in general. I think a lot of people know about it. And I was like, is it too much milk? I really want to feed the people. And I thought, it's also good to review. It's good to review and see things again. And I also think within the parable of the Good Samaritan, there's a lot of deep misunderstandings. And so I thought maybe that's what I would point out with some of these deep misunderstandings as we work through the passage. And then Nick got up on Wednesday, and he was preaching on the light of the world. And he had a real strong emphasis on the gospel and evangelism. And this exchange is clearly a gospel message. And it's apologetics. It's both. So you see Jesus doing apologetics, and you see the gospel being done. And I've always said, I say this in all my class, apologetics isn't the gospel. Okay, apologetics just busts down the barriers so that one will actually hear the gospel presentation. All right, so I say apologetics is pre-evangelism. But in this exchange, I find it interesting that Jesus masterfully employs apologetics and transitions into evangelism almost seamlessly. So let's start with the beginning of the exchange. The beginning exchange. So we'll go back to verse 25. Verse 25, and it says, "And behold." Behold. We're going to stop right there. Luke is the one narrating this story, and just previously through chapter 10, he has recounted the sending out of the 70, 2 by 2, in order to evangelize. And he tells the 70 to enter cities, to perform miracles, and to preach that the kingdom of God is at hand. He also tells the 70 that some of the cities will not receive them. And when they come across those cities, to shake the dust off their feet and move on. He tells them that the cities that refuse them will have a greater judgment than that of Sodom. Okay? Then in verse 13, he names two of those cities, Chorazin and Bethsaida. And Jesus, knowing the counterfactuals, being omniscient, tells them that Tyre and Sidon would have repented if the 70 had visited their city and performed those same works. And then he drops a third city into the fray and says Capernaum is in trouble as well. And then some time passes, and in verse 17, the 70 return, and they're super excited. They're excited about everything that they've accomplished in the name of Jesus, and they're really focused on the power, specifically the power they had over the devils. And Jesus tells them, he kind of corrects them a little bit gently. He says that their focus is off, that yes, he gave them power over the devils, but that they should rejoice more in their salvation than in having powers over the devils. And so there's just some food for thought there. Jesus then rejoices in the Father and accomplishing his will. And then Jesus starts to preach the disciples privately. And then seemingly out of nowhere, there might be a break of time, it doesn't really say, but out of nowhere, this lawyer pops up. He just pops up, and Jesus is teaching, and so Luke is setting the stage. Luke, interestingly enough, he's the only one who records this exchange. You won't find it in any of the other Gospels. And he starts the exchange by saying, "And behold." And the word behind the Greek there simply just means to focus, pay attention, look with understanding, okay? Behold, stop, all right? And he's writing this to who? To Theophilus. Theophilus is his target audience. So he's saying to Theophilus, pay attention. I'm about to show you something. And by extension, Luke is saying that to us here today. Okay? He's telling us, stop, pay attention. I need you to focus on this. So we should pay attention to the account. Luke thought it important enough to explicitly tell us to pay attention. So let's do it. So verse 25, he says, "And behold, a certain." So we're going to stop at certain now. I'm not going to stop at every word, I promise, but we're going to stop at quite a few of them. Certain. So he says, pay attention here. There's this certain lawyer. And I'm going to circle back to this later, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But that the fact that this is a certain lawyer tells us a couple of things. One, it tells us that this lawyer is a real person. Okay? And two, it tells us seemingly that the name of the lawyer is unknown to Luke, or Luke opted not to give his name for whatever reason. There's a reason. But Luke didn't give his name. Either he didn't know it or he opted not to. So just remember that. The lawyer is certainly real, but there's no name provided. And so we have, "And behold, a certain lawyer." We'll stop at lawyer now. Outside of the Gospel of Matthew, who uses the word once, there's no other gospel writer who uses this word. Luke uses the word lawyer 6 times in his gospel, and Paul uses it 1 time in the book of Titus. Now, in reading about lawyer and what it was in Jesus' day, some suggest that lawyers and scribes were synonymous. But as I worked through this, I realized that it's 2 different words in the Greek. And Jesus distinguishes between them when he addresses the scribes and Pharisees together. He says, okay, scribes and Pharisees, woe unto you. And he gives a whole list of woes in Luke chapter 11, verses 44 through 46. He goes through all these lists of woes on the scribes and Pharisees. And when he's done with the scribes and Pharisees, the lawyers say, hey, what you're saying about them applies to us too. And Jesus is like, yes, it does. They said it in more of a negative way, like as if it was unjustified, but it was justified. So I don't believe that lawyers and scribes were necessarily synonymous. And the lawyers seemed to understand that. When Jesus addressed the scribes, they said, hey, that applies to us as well. And I found it interesting as I was working through this too, that the translation Miles Coverdale translated in his version, he's the only one who uses the word scribe here instead of lawyer. Every other translation from William Tyndale forward, because Tyndale changes it from scribe to lawyer, everyone forward uses the word lawyer at that point. So it's lawyer in every English translation I could find afterwards. So now a lawyer back then is a little bit different than what we have for today for lawyers. Lawyers today essentially function in mediation and in courtrooms, prosecution, defense, things of that nature. But lawyers back then were more like what we would refer to as a scholar today. All right, they were experts in the law. Now, they might have done some mediation because of their expertise, but overall, they were teaching the law and what it meant. So they would be more like scholars today. We use the word doctor pretty interchangeably. Doctor of this, doctor of that, and then we have medical doctors. So a lawyer was an expert in the law. Okay? So in what law was this lawyer expert in? It wasn't Roman law. He wasn't interested in the Roman law. What he was interested in was the Torah. So he was an expert in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible particularly. So that's who this man is, an expert in Old Testament. Okay? And so it says in verse 25, and behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him. Now, this lawyer stood up and tempted him. I found this to be interesting, because as I was studying this, there's a lot of internal debate as to whether or not this lawyer, this expert, was genuinely testing Jesus to see if he was a false teacher, or if his motives were more nefarious and he was trying to entrap Jesus, trying to catch him in trying to entrap him, essentially. So the Greek word here is interesting. Typically, I don't like to use a single source when I look up a word. I like to compare lexicons to see if there's any disagreement and nuance, and see then if I can determine through study which lexicon I think better represents the translation of the word. Most of the time, probably 95% of the time, there's no disagreement, but there was here in this word, tempt. So primarily, just to give you guys a heads up of what I do, my favorite lexicons are the BDAG and the Loneida. I've mentioned both of them from the pulpit before. I also reference the Strongs and Blue Letter's Bible usage. They have a Bible usage section in Blue Letter. I use that a lot. And while I'm on Blue Letter, they have a lexicon there. You should reference it. It's Thayer's lexicon. So I'll reference all 4 of these and compare them, see if there's any disagreement. And comparing all these resources, it became clear to me that it was unclear to these men which was the motive behind the lawyer's question, or his standing up to tempt. So some would automatically assume that he has a negative motive since he was tempting Jesus by referring to one of the multiple passages that say, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. Or some variation of that. There's a lot of those throughout the Bible. And we are told many times in Scripture not to tempt God. But there's a few places in which God desires that you prove him. And it's the same word used for tempt. In Malachi, God demands that the Israelites prove him, and it's also translated tempt elsewhere in that same passage. In Isaiah, God tells the Israelites to test him against the other false gods to see who is the true God. He does the same thing in Deuteronomy, and in Isaiah chapter 7, God tells Ahaz to ask for a sign, and Ahaz responds by saying, I don't want to tempt you. And God says, essentially, I don't care. I'm going to give you a sign anyway. And so in that sense, we end up getting prophecies about the coming Messiah. So in that sense, God is saying it wasn't a sin to tempt him in that case, or to test him. Yet there are many, many cases in the Old Testament where men are essentially proving God, testing God, and God not only allows it, but he meets the challenge and oftentimes blesses them in doing so. So the Christian life is full of discernment. We have to be discerning people. And so we need to understand a little bit about this. When is it okay to put God to the test, and when isn't it? If you approach the Bible in a holistic fashion, you'll see that there are essentially 3 different reasons that testing God occurs. And I will submit that one of them is positive, and the other 2 are very negative. Okay? So I'll start with the positive case. There's many times in the Bible, I believe, where you'll get this sort of sentiment. It's not always laid out this way. It's not. Actually, it's only laid out this way one time, but it's the same sentiment throughout, which is, I believe, help thou my unbelief. All right? In many cases, the person in the Bible is struggling with knowing for sure what the will of God is, or they're fearful. And in these situations, they often ask for a sign or something to ensure that what they believe God is telling them to do is truly from God, right? They're looking for a way to bolster that confidence. They aren't asking in rebellion, but they're asking in submission, right? I want to do what you're asking me to do. I just want to make sure it's you, okay? And so, God, you've promised me this. Fulfill your promise. You see that a lot in the Old Testament. God, it is in your nature for you to want me to obey you. I want to obey you. Help me to obey you. Okay, this is some of the attitude of some people who test God in the Old Testament. In fact, in every case where God is telling people to test him or to try him or to prove him, it is so that they will obey him after the fact. Amen. That's the whole point. So that's the positive. That's the only good reason to put God to the test. Now, here are the 2 negatives. Testing God's patience. God is merciful and he's gracious. And some of us take advantage of God's mercy and his grace, and God tells us not to test his patience. You can see this in the Israelites when they're in the desert, in the wilderness, I should say. They tested God's patience and mercy, and he condemns them for doing that. And we ought not to be guilty of that, but I imagine we often are. Okay? So let's not test God's patience. He is gracious and merciful. He's also just. And then the third one is when you're trying to entrap God, right? This is essentially what Satan did in the wilderness with Jesus, right? He was trying to entrap him. He tempts Jesus in order to get him to sin, right? That's one. I also think that the stereotypical atheist comment, if God existed, he would strike me dead right here, right now, I think falls into this category as well, of entrapping God to do something that would be against his nature. So trying to entrap God into doing something that would be against his nature would never work. And tempting God in order to manipulate God or to try to trap him is the height of pride. Okay, it's the height of pride. So these are the 3 areas, and so the question is, which of these 3 is it for the lawyer? Was he asking so that he could submit and obey God? Or was his question asking and somehow it was testing God's patience? Or was his question designed to entrap Jesus? I believe his question was designed to entrap Jesus, and I'll flesh this out further in the text. But I do want to stop here and focus and draw your attention to this for a moment, because whether or not this man was sincere, it really doesn't matter for the point I'm going to make here. It's the fact that he was testing Jesus. And you are going to be tested. There will be men today who will test you in the very exact same way. Right? So 1 Peter 3:15, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. That is what's happening in this passage. People are going to test you, and you do need to be ready with an answer. And Jesus did not just dismiss this man. Sometimes I fear that we do such things. We might say, oh, you're just a scorner. I do not have to answer you, according to Proverbs. Nope, Jesus was not only prepared for an answer, but Luke is telling us to pay attention to how he does this. Okay? So let's continue with the exchange. Luke 10:25, and behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Now, this is essentially the best question anybody could ever ask. What shall I do to inherit eternal life? They are literally inviting you to give them the gospel. Now, what prompted this expert to ask this question this way? Remember, he's an expert in the Old Testament. Jesus has talked about eternal life multiple times in the Gospels, but the Old Testament primarily just makes inferences to eternal life, except for in Daniel 12:2. So let's just go to Daniel 12:2 real quick. We're not going to turn to a ton of passages today. I'll reference some of them. We're going to stay in Luke 10 through most of this, but we'll go to Daniel chapter 12 right now to see what I believe prompted this lawyer's question to begin with. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Okay? So some to everlasting life, and some to everlasting contempt. Now, the Jewish expectation was to do whatever was necessary to be a part of the group that awakes to everlasting life, to receive that eternal inheritance. That was their goal here. That was their expectation. And that is what the lawyer is asking to Jesus. What do I have to do to be part of the group that receives eternal life? And again, probably it is the most important question anyone could ask. So let's move on to Jesus' response. Jesus' response. He said unto him, verse 26, he said unto him, what is written in the law? How readest thou? What is written in the law? How readest thou? So I want you to notice, I want you to behold, focus, how does Jesus handle this? He returns the question back to him. He says, you're the expert in the law. Tell me, how do you read it? Does Jesus know what is written in the law? Obviously. He wrote the law. Not only did he write it, but he's omniscient. So he knows exactly what the law means. So sometimes you might have the answer. You should still let them answer it. It's a good tactic, if you will, to put the question back on them. And also, does he not know that the lawyer actually understands it? Of course he does. He knows what the lawyer is going to answer because he's omniscient. So why ask the questions? Why ask the questions? Well, for one, doing this builds a relationship with the lawyer. Okay, albeit a short relationship, but he defers to the lawyer, and in doing this, he gives deference to the lawyer, giving him the floor. Right? This shows meekness. Right? Jesus is meek, and he doesn't have to be here. He has the answers. It's his law. Okay? But again, I think we need to take from this as well. How do we handle people? All right? I think this is a really smart move. This allows the lawyer to show his expertise or his ignorance. This allows everyone present to hear what the lawyer believes the answer is. And the lawyer is regarded as an expert by the culture there, so his interpretation will carry weight. Okay? Sometimes in our pride, though, or maybe in our zeal just to answer the question, especially if we think we know the answer, we just jump to it. We jump right to the answer. But by allowing them to have the floor, you are showing meekness, and this can go a long way with the audience and the one your interlocutor, the one you're debating with. This goes a long way by doing this. It creates a relationship. Again, albeit a short one, but it does create a relationship. Also, if you ask this question sincerely, you're going to do what's called active listening. And active listening is something I struggle with, right? Where you actively listen to the person and then you ask more questions about what they just said in more interest. This isn't necessarily prying into their personal life, but this is, let me understand your worldview. How did you come to this conclusion? And done right, this isn't aggressive at all. but it comes off as being genuinely interested in the person. I have a guy at work who's really good at this. You can tell him something an offhanded comment about your weekend, some small thing that you did, and he'll begin to ask questions about it, showing interest in something that he probably has no real interest in, but I think he's interested in people, right? And we should be interested in people. So this is something I'm striving to do better at, okay? And I think this goes into that cliche, that is a cliche, but I think it's actually true, is no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care, right? So by asking questions, you're demonstrating that you care. I want to know what you believe. I want to know how you got there, right? And this builds that relationship. This is, I believe, a great example of how we should deal with people. And that's what Jesus is doing here. Number 2, remember this is something we should be paying attention to. Luke told us to pay attention to this, and I'm going to give you another one that this doesn't apply to Jesus, but does apply to us. Doing this, asking this question, putting it back on them, gets you off the hot seat. Okay? Jesus is fine under pressure, right? But sometimes we aren't. Sometimes under pressure we slip up and we say things we don't mean. Or I shouldn't have said it that way, right? Jesus doesn't need to do that, but I think we can still learn from this, learning to get off the hot seat and just take a moment to process. And sometimes we're taken off guard by the question, and it really isn't wise to answer a question you don't know the answer to, right? So take a step back. If someone is clearly tempting you with a question, instead of feeling under pressure and answering it unwisely, take a step back and ask them if they have an answer to the question. And then ask them what that answer is. Now, I do believe you should be ready with an answer, but we're not Jesus, so there are going to be times when we're not. But we should be working towards that. And so when you do this, you get to take a break, you get to gather your thoughts, and you give the floor back to them, and then you make them answer the question. And in my experience, you'll receive one of two responses. Either one, I don't know, that's why I'm asking you. I've heard that one a lot. I don't know the answer, that's why I'm asking. At that point, you should be able to drop your guard a little bit. Typically, people who answer this way are actually seeking truth, and they just humbled themselves by saying they don't know, and they are hoping you do. At that point, if you still don't know the answer, ask them for time. Ask them for time. The second way is that they do have an answer, and it may be right, or it may be the wrong answer, but their answer will help focus the conversation so you can see their agenda, or their misconceptions, or the point that they're trying to drive at. Sometimes you don't know why the person's asking you the question, right? And then in your answer, you've never actually addressed the point they're trying to make. So by asking them to give you the answer, you can find the point. And then you know that that's the real issue we have to deal with. So don't be afraid to take a step back and put it back on them. Be wise as a serpent, but harmless as a dove. Now, in this case, Jesus is posing the question to someone who should already know the answer. He's an expert in the law. And so he should tell you what the law says. This helps us a little bit to see the motive behind the question as well. As an expert, he asks the question knowing the answer already. Knowing the answer already. So now, Jesus has the fortunate ability to be more of an expert, but be the master of every subject. Be the master of every subject. So, on the other hand, we don't. If some expert is trying to entrap you by their expertise, and you're not well-versed in that subject matter, don't take the bait. If someone comes to me and they want to disprove God by demonstrating quantum mechanics, I'm not going to try to prove them wrong. I'm going to go find answers. Okay? I'm not going to take the bait and try to debate quantum mechanics with someone, and I don't know anything about quantum mechanics. Okay? So don't take the bait. Instead, go study to show thyself approved, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed. Okay? Ask him to provide the answer. Why do you think that disproves God, or whatever the situation is? Okay? Then thank them for the answer and tell them you'll need to look into it before providing your own answer. Don't try to make up an answer on the fly. It will bring shame to you. Okay? So this lawyer is testing Jesus to see what Jesus will say, and Jesus turns the question back on him. The lawyer, being an expert, provides the correct answer. Let's read it. Verse 27. And he answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. So the lawyer's answer is, he's quoting the Shema, which is found in Deuteronomy 6:5, which says, And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And then he combines that with Luke chapter 19 and verse 18, in which it says there, And thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, I am the Lord. So he combines two verses, and he says, this is how you inherit eternal life. And the Lord is pleased with this answer. Jesus is pleased with the answer. Look at verse 28. And he said unto them, Thou hast answered right. This do, and thou shalt live. So this is critical here. I think sometimes we have a natural tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? The lawyer answered correctly, even though we know the lawyer was probably mischievous. He still answered right. So even if you know the person you are dealing with is having bad intentions, you ought to acknowledge when they answer something correctly. Acknowledge it. In fact, in classical apologetics, that is the tactic, is you find something, a point of common agreement, and you launch off that, right? Find a point of common agreement. And so here, Jesus and the lawyer have a point of common agreement. So don't be a contrarian with the person you're dealing with for the sake of being a contrarian, just because you know they have bad motives. Listen to what they say, and if it's true and biblical, acknowledge it. Acknowledge it. Don't try to make them disagree with you. If someone you generally disagree with you is right, say so. You're not giving up any ground. You're not conceding the argument. You're not even affirming his agenda. Okay? So acknowledge it. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, I also find the answer that is given to be extremely interesting. If someone were to come up to you and ask, how can I go to heaven, or how can I be saved, how can I inherit eternal life, you wouldn't, or at least I wouldn't, in my gut reaction, give them the Shema. And then say, and love your neighbor as yourself. I might go through Romans Road. I might go to the Ten Commandments and work through the Ten Commandments in an effort to demonstrate that they are sinful and in need of a Savior. That's my typical tactic, how I work through that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But until studying this through years ago, I never would have started with the Shema and then tacked on, love your neighbor as yourself. And you might say, well, that sounds an awful lot like works righteousness. And I would say, yes, of course. Yet Jesus affirms this, but he's going to qualify this pretty quickly. Okay? The conversation, however, could have stopped right there. Do this and live, and then there would have been no parable. But there's some historical context you need to understand here. Before Jesus was born, so well before Jesus was born, in the BC era, there were two rabbis who were greatly revered by the people in Jesus' day. However, they disagreed in a few different areas of interpretation of the Torah, which is interesting because as I was studying this, some would say they disagreed in 3 areas, some said 5. But as I started looking into it, I realized that there was a lot of disagreement. It wasn't just 5 points. So, and most of the debates that you see in the Gospels, were about these two viewpoints, these two schools, if you will. Which one of these was correct? They often wanted to know where Jesus stood with regard to these two houses or these two schools of teaching. So there were two houses. One was the house of Shammai. They were considered to be a lot more strict. And then the other house was the house of Hillel. They were considered oftentimes much more liberal. It was a common saying in that day was the school of Shammai binds, the school of Hillel loosens. which I just thought was interesting when you're considering the subject matter of Matthew 18. But there are various areas in which they disagreed. One was on the topic of divorce, right? The school of Shammai believed that you could only divorce for extremely serious offenses like adultery. The school on Hillel, on the other hand, believed that you could divorce for an offense as simple as your wife burning your food. Okay? So just to give you some extreme things there. And hence, that question was posed to Jesus. Can we divorce for any reason? Right? So now you're seeing some of that historical context. Another area of disagreement was the school of Hillel believed that anyone could study and teach the Torah and teach it to anyone. So anyone could study and teach the Torah, and the audience that is being taught could be anyone. However, the school of Shammai believed only worthy students could study and teach the Torah, and the Torah should only be taught to those who are proven to be worthy. So there, you can see some of that disagreement as well. So what does that have to do with the exchange between this lawyer and Jesus? Well, it has to do with the next verse, verse 29. Verse 29. But he, willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" So let's look at a couple of things here. Remember, earlier we were trying to discern whether or not the lawyer was tempting Jesus in order to entrap him, or if he was sincerely seeking truth. And I think this sentence reveals it, right? I said, remember, the purpose of testing God was with an attitude of, I want to obey. I want to make sure that it is God that I'm obeying, right? So if you were to ask Jesus this type of question for the reason, I want to know who my neighbor is because I want to treat them appropriately, I think that would be appropriate, right? But that's not what this lawyer's intention was. His intention was to justify himself. So this would go into category number 3 in rebellion, right? I want to justify myself. So here this lawyer's desire was not to obey God, but to justify himself. So his intention in testing Jesus was not truth-seeking, but demonstrating self-righteousness. So I think the translators opting to use the word tempt here is very appropriate. This was entrapment, not humility. Okay? But he is asking the million-dollar question, and it is the point of this exchange. Who is my neighbor? And why ask that question? Okay, well, we go back to those two schools. Well, depending on which house you were in would determine how you answered that question. The house of Shammai interpreted the Torah as saying only those in the house of Israel were neighbors. They would justify that passage by going to places like Psalm 139, 21. Do I not hate them, O Lord, that hate thee? Am I not grieved with those that rise up against thee? Right? And there's many passages like that throughout the Psalms. And so what they did is they turned that hatred into a virtue. Okay? And so I don't love my neighbor. I hate them that hate you. That's how I love God. Okay? While the house of Hillel believed that Gentiles were included in the category of neighbor. Okay, so now you have this disagreement, and you can see which side the lawyer might have been on. In this attempt to justify himself, the lawyer seeks to answer the question, who is my neighbor? The teaching of the Hillel was also, though, a bit of a bare minimum. In general, that's what the house of Hillel taught, was bare minimum. How do we get to eternal life? That bare minimum. In fact, I think we do that even in our own relationships sometimes, right? We have that stereotypical old father, I put clothes on your back, a roof on your head, and food in your belly. What more do you want from me? I do the bare minimum. And that was kind of the idea behind the school of Hillel, was the bare minimum. In fact, when you are reading through it, if you go to, in the Talmud, Shabbat 31a, Hillel is recorded as saying this regarding who is your neighbor, essentially. What is hateful to you, what is hateful to you, to your fellow, don't do. That is the entirety of the Torah. Everything else is commentary. Go study. That's what Hillel said. All right? So he wanted to justify himself. The lawyer wanted to justify himself by doing the bare minimum possible. And like many of us, we are asked, we do the same thing. What is the bare minimum I can do to get by or to obtain favor or something of that nature, right? What's the bare minimum I need to do? And here's the other thing that I found was interesting. He's trying to justify himself by defining who neighbor is, which means his assumption is that I love God with all my heart, body, and soul. I've checked that box. I've checked that box. But I need to make sure I love my neighbor as I love myself. And I need to make sure I define neighbor because depending on how you define it, I may or may not check that box. So when it came to neighbor, it was a matter of interpretation for him. And based on the parable Jesus gives, we can infer which house this lawyer was in. He would have been in the house of Shammai, saying that only the house of Israel is my neighbor. Now, just so you are aware, more often than not, the Hillel, as time went on, became more and more authoritative. House of Hillel was extremely influential as well. And to give you an idea of how influential the house of Hillel was, when Paul gives his credentials, he says that he was taught by Gamaliel. Gamaliel was a Sanhedrin, and he's a direct descendant of Hillel himself. Okay? So, and Gamaliel was highly regarded, potentially one of the most highly regarded Sanhedrin in his day, and Paul was taught by him. So when he lists his credentials, he lists Gamaliel. To be taught by Gamaliel would have been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So this lawyer of the house of Shammai, on this point specifically, was actually the majority view of Israel at the time. The majority view of Israel at the time was that their neighbor was Israelites. And the house of Israel was their only neighbors. And so from this lawyer's perspective, he's all set. He checks the box. I treat the Israelites really well, right? And so I love God with all my heart, mind, and soul, check. I love my neighbor as myself, check. I inherit eternal life. All right. So the parable of the Good Samaritan, verse 30. And Jesus answering said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among the thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, I do want to point out here that I find this to be interesting. Remember earlier I said that Luke started his narrative by saying a certain lawyer, and that this inferred that the lawyer was real, but his name was withheld for one reason or another. I actually do believe, and if you don't, that's okay, but I actually do believe that this parable and many others are actually true stories. Jesus started this narrative in the exact same way Luke starts his. A certain man, a certain lawyer, okay? But then Jesus goes on with a certain priest, and likewise a Levite, and a certain Samaritan. The word certain gives a sense of certainty, certainly. So a little play on words there. So this moves the parable from the realm of hypothetical into the realm of reality, which I believe only emphasizes the point even more, that it's that something someone did. Now, many people like to allegorize the parables. And to be fair, sometimes there are allegorical elements in the parables, but nearly in every circumstance that I can think of in which there are allegorical elements, Jesus will follow up with an explanation working through those elements. He'll tell you, this means this, and this means this, right? But in this case, Jesus has no follow-up explanation, and the meaning of the parable is so plain and so self-evident that the lawyer understands the point of the parable immediately. It requires no explanation, which is different than most of the parables. The point of the parables, Jesus said, was to bring judgment on the hearers because they refused to hear him. And so I'm going to speak in parable so they can't understand, and I'll explain the parable to those who do want to understand. In this case, he's giving a very plain understanding of the parable. However, some people still do attempt to allegorize them. So I like to read through church history and see how people interpret things in the Bible. And so I came across Origen, right, in the 3rd century. So he's in the 3rd century. And he says this about the parable. He says, one of the elders wanted to interpret the parable as follows. The man going down is Adam. Jerusalem is paradise. And Jericho is the world. The robbers are hostile powers. The priest is the law. The Levite is the prophets. The Samaritan is Christ. The wounds are disobedience. The beast is the Lord's body. The pancodium, that's the inn, which accepts all who wish to enter, is the church. And further, the 2 denarii mean the Father and the Son. The manager of the stable is the head of the church, to whom its care has been entrusted. And the fact that the Samaritan promises he will return represents the Savior's second coming. All of this has been said reasonably and beautifully. That's a lot of allegory. And the lawyer didn't understand any of that. Okay? So, yet he understood the parable. In fact, I was reading later, John Calvin actually talks about Origen's statement here, and he says, in my own words, I'm just going to paraphrase it, but it's garbage and entirely misses the point. And so there's a lot I disagree with John Calvin on, but on that, we agree. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time hypothesizing and trying to give you different interpretations about the motives of the priest or the Levite. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing that and digging into. I think the meaning of the parable is just very self-evident. Like, it's plain reading. So what we have here is a man who's beaten almost to death and left there. And a highly respected office of the priest seeing the man, and his motives for seeing this man and going around are entirely irrelevant to the story. It really doesn't matter what his motives were, per se. I hear a lot of preachers say, well, he didn't want to touch him because then he'd have to go through the purification process. Or he was afraid that he'd be jumped if he went and helped the man. The robbers were hiding behind the rock or something of that nature. None of this is in the text. What is in the text, though, we'll get to. But we do see that the priest sees the man half dead and goes around. And then, again, he's expected. And so let's just read the verse 31. And by chance there came down a certain priest, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Then another one that's respected by heritage was a Levite, who did the same as the priest in verse 32. And likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. So these guys did more than just not help. They avoided the man as much as possible by going hard to the other side of the road. Here's a man that's badly beaten, naked, stripped of all of his possessions, on the verge of death, needing immediate care, and these men, the priest and the Levite, avoid him. We see this today too, right? People who film tragedy on their smartphones instead of helping. And as a society, typically we condemn them, and rightly so. And so here they see someone who is in need, and instead of helping, they move to the other side of the road, seeing him desperate. Verse 33. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him. Now that is the motive that matters, right? What is missing from the other two? Compassion. They had no compassion on him. They thought only of themselves, and they couldn't be bothered to help, and it doesn't matter why, because it doesn't justify them, right? Whatever the reason is no justification. So the Samaritan, on the other hand, he had compassion. And it's obvious that Jesus picked these people intentionally because it's possible that being a lawyer, that he was also a priest. And if he was a priest, he was by necessity a Levite. And so Jesus doesn't beat around the bush. He essentially inserts the lawyer into the story. And that's the point of the parable. We should also be inserting ourselves into the story, okay? And ultimately, we should see ourselves the same way that the lawyer should have seen himself. We'll circle back there. But remember, the lawyer's attempt was to justify himself. And what he has was a problem with loving his neighbor. So as long as the neighbor was the house of Israel, he was okay. But there was a Samaritan here, and the Samaritan was seen as his enemy, and the Samaritan is the one who had the compassion. And I found it interesting that Jesus chose the Samaritan to be the object of the subject of the one who has compassion. And the lawyer has no compassion for Samaritans culturally. And why is that? Why was there hatred for the Samaritans by the Jews? What was that? And we know from reading the Gospels that there was definitely public animosity between these two groups. And it's often said that it was because the Samaritans were a half-breed, Jew and Gentile. And while that actually is probably true from what I can tell, I don't understand why that would be the hatred for them. Because if you read throughout the Old Testament, the Jews consistently intermarried with Gentiles and pagans and had no problems with it. In fact, it was always a prophet who came around and said, hey, don't do that. You've commanded you not to do that. Stop doing that. And they'd have to repent and do it right. But it never bred hatred. So it always boggled my mind that it was simply, and some might suggest, well, it was racism. Okay, that's possible, but again, I don't see that in the text. So I decided to kind of dig into this a little bit, see if I can understand why there was such a great hatred for the Samaritan by the Jew. And it's Josephus who gives us much of this account. Josephus tells us that he's the one where we get our source from, that the Samaritan was half Jew, half Gentile. That's where the source is. But Josephus tells us much more than that. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to give you a brief overview history of the groups, because there's a lot of detail here. But I want to tell you this so that you have a better understanding of why this animosity exists. And when I'm done telling you, you may feel that the Jews' hatred of the Samaritans was justified. In fact, I know I did after reading through it. I was like, oh, I get it now. Like, I would be struggling with this too. And it's not because they were a half-breed. So to understand this, we have to go all the way back to the Assyrian captivity of the 10 northern tribes. So the land back then, when Israel was displaced, it was replaced with a group called the Kuthians. Okay? They were essentially from Persia. That was what their name meant. The Hebrews gave them the name Kuthians, okay, from their Persian descent. That's where they came from. However, the Greeks called them Samaritai. Okay, so the Kuthians and the Samaritai. So they were coming from Samaria. And so that's where they came into the land. So you just understand how they got there. Okay? Fast forward to the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, when the Israelites were allowed to return to rebuild the temple. The Kuthians were afraid that the Israelites would kill them all or cause them to leave, one or the other. So they did two things. One, they identified themselves as the descendants of Joseph. And two, they claimed to serve Jehovah. Okay, so, hey, we're family. We're from Joseph. And by the way, there's a lot of time here, and there's some intermingling, because not all the Israelites were gone, right? There was still some of the 10 tribes that were left. So they were saying, hey, we're part of you. And just in case that's not enough, we also serve Jehovah. All right, so they came off as proselytes. However, the men in Israel at the time found they were suspicious of this. They were suspicious of their claims that they were serving Jehovah, but erring on the side of caution, the Israelites tolerated them. Now, every time Israel found themselves in trouble, either being judged by God or being attacked by another nation, the Samaritans would always distance themselves from the Israelites, saying that they were not one of them. So when trouble came, when Israel came, they're like, we're one of you. And then when trouble came, they're like, no, we're not. And they would distance themselves. Okay? They wanted to be Israelites when it benefited them, and they wanted to be anything but an Israelite when they were in trouble. When the Jews were rebuilding the temple, Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Then, so if you read through world history, you'll see that Alexander the Great eventually makes his way south, and Josephus records an event in which Alexander the Great visits Israel. And he's the only one who records this, and I'm not going to get into all the detail there. But when Alexander the Great leaves, two things occur. One, it's the only temple that Alexander the Great did not demand to worship in. Right? Every other temple, he said, let me go and sacrifice in your temple. But when it came to Israel, he said no. And when the Israelites would have died for it, just like the city of Tyre did. But the city of Tyre did die, and Alexander the Great didn't crush Israel for it. Now, when he left, he did another thing that was pretty interesting for Israel. He made Israel tax exempt. Every other country had to pay taxes to Alexander the Great, but Israel didn't. And the Samaritans, when they got wind of it, they said, hey, we're Israelite too. Make us tax exempt. He didn't, but they attempted to, right? And then when they were rebuilding the temple, the Samaritans saw that there was a great opposition for the temple, that there was a lot of opposition, and so they actually sent letters to the king saying, giving the king reasons why he shouldn't let them rebuild the temple, right? So they were opposing him through letter. But then it gets worse. When the king doesn't respond, they start taking pigs and throwing them into the construction site of the temple, so that every single time, and not just pigs, dead human bodies as well. And so that every time that the Israelites would try to go to work, they'd have to go through a cleansing process. And some, read the Old Testament, take Steve's class. You'll understand what that cleansing process looks like. It's not a short thing, and it's a great reason why, it's a large reason why the temple took 70 years to build, because they had this constant opposition. The Samaritans knew, and so they'd throw pigs. Go forward a little further in history, you have Antiochus. Antiochus was an evil, wicked man. And during the Maccabean revolt, so you hear the book of Maccabees and the Apocrypha, you can read about the Maccabean revolt. And in that, Antiochus is the one who's attempting to slaughter them. He sacrifices a pig on the temple's altar to himself. He names himself God. And the Samaritans distance themselves. The Maccabeans slaughter his priest and then run to the hills. They run to the hills to hide, and they engage in guerrilla warfare to attack the Maccabeans. To attack Antiochus and his men. Antiochus slaughtered 40,000 Jews in 2 days. And the Samaritans did not run to the hills. They stayed behind and they plundered what the Maccabeans left behind. And they told Antiochus, we're not one of them. And then they sided with Antiochus. 40,000 Jews, and the Samaritans are taking your stuff. Now, the Maccabeans ultimately win. They win that, and you learn about that when you celebrate Hanukkah. For those who celebrate Hanukkah, that's the victory of the Maccabean revolt. But then Israel only had independence for a very short time before they were conquered by Rome, and then that's the setting we're in today. So just before all of this, they lost a bunch to Antiochus, and the Samaritans were a part of that. And here they are intermingling with the Samaritans. Your family, your stuff, your history has been riddled with Samaritan deceit and betrayal. We're Israel? No, we're not. We're Israel? No, we're not. And at every turn, they betrayed Israel. Okay? I get it. Like your temple, the temple that you're going to worship at, took 70 years to build. Why? Because of those people. Every time they go and worship, they're thankful for their temple. But it's them. They're like, you're not allowed at our temple. And they had their own temple. So yeah, I get it. So that's why they were hated. That's a big part of it. And there's a lot of detail in that. I didn't want to get into all of that. It actually took a little longer than I intended to. But it's from this group of people that Jesus says has the compassion on the Israelite. That has not been their history. This would be unthinkable to the lawyer, right? No, it would be the bandits that were the Samaritans. Oh, you want to talk to me about a good Samaritan? The only good Samaritan is a dead Samaritan. That would have been their idea. So if we go back to Luke chapter 10, verse 34, all right? And so we're talking about the Samaritan now. And he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The Samaritan uses his resources, oil and wine, essentially using the oil and wine as an antiseptic, and then he bound up the wounds with his own supplies. He probably had to tear his own clothes to do it. Then he puts him on his beast, meaning he was probably going to have to walk instead of ride. And then he brings him to the inn and continues to take care of him there. So let's read the next verse. And on the morrow he departed, and he took out 2 pence and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. So he spent the entire night with him, right? Because it says on the morrow he left. So he took him to the end, and then the next day he left. So he spent all night taking care of him. And when he leaves the innkeeper with a blank check. He says, spend whatever you need to take care of him. I will repay it when I return. So I assume that this was the innkeeper was familiar with him, right? So he knew he was going to return. This was a common path that he took. But he writes a blank check, and he gives him 2 pence, or 2 denarii is the actual coinage that was used, which some have estimated potentially that it would have covered 2 months of residence at the inn. So 2 months he paid for. That's a pretty big deal to pay for 2 months. Also, that gives you an idea of the concept of his wounds, that he thought he would need to stay there for at least 2 months, right? Because I'm leaving you with that. That's got to be the minimum, and I'll be back to pay whatever is in excess. So this is a big deal. The amount of resources the Samaritan provided for his enemy was extravagant. It was very lavish, very extravagant. And Jesus is clearly driving that point home. And after demonstrating a great deal of compassion with actions of the Samaritan, he asks, Which of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves? Which of these 3 was neighbor to him that fell among the thieves? Jesus brings it back around, but with a twist. The lawyer asked, Who is my neighbor? We expect the answer to be the one who was beaten. He's the neighbor. He's the one in need. So the interpretation is help those who are in need. But this isn't what Jesus asked to him. He asked, who was neighbor to the beaten man? He twists it. The neighbor in this parable is the Good Samaritan. You see that? The answer is backwards. It's backwards. Jesus is saying the question is not, who is my neighbor? The question is, are you a neighbor? Are you a neighbor? And that's the takeaway. That's the point. Are you the Good Samaritan? Who is your neighbor? Are you the neighbor? Are you the neighbor? And again, though, the lawyer answers correctly. It's not all of this allegory about the church and who this person is and who that person is. He just sees the parable for what it is. It's plain. The understanding's plain. And the lawyer understands. And he said, he that showed mercy on him. Then Jesus said unto him, Go and do likewise. So the lawyer was able to discern the plain meaning of the parable. And Jesus said unto him, Go and do likewise. And Jesus says unto us, Go and do likewise. And his response should be the same as our response. I have never done that, nor could I ever do that consistently, because it's not enough to do it once. You see, this isn't a one-time thing. This is a way you're supposed to live your life every day. With every interaction in your life, you ought to have perfect love and perfect love to God and perfect love to everyone around you. Absolute, lavish, holy, blank check, sacrificial love. And you ought to respond, I can't do that. Amen. I can't either. And therefore, you will not inherit eternal life. But praise the Lord, while we were yet sinners, while we were yet incapable of fulfilling the law, Christ died for us. The lawyer was looking for the bare minimum he could do to inherit eternal life. And the bare minimum was more than he can do. It was everything. His entire life, from birth to death, had to be lived in perfection. That lawyer needed to see his insufficiency. And unfortunately, this story ends with silence on the part of the lawyer. 1 Peter 2:15 says, "For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men." And it's unfortunate, but if you're here today and you haven't responded, I don't want you to leave today in silence to this story. There is nothing you can do. There is no bare minimum work for you that isn't everything. You have to rely on the finished work of Jesus. There's no balancing of the scales. Good works outweigh the bad works. That's not the case. It has to be all of the weight is on one side, none on the other. And the only one who did that was Jesus. And so you can't rely on your works, but for whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Repent and believe, for today is the day of salvation. For those of you who have, right, most of the people in here today, I presume, are saved. So some of this might be preaching to the choir. But if you're not, take that warning. You will not inherit eternal life. But if you have two lessons that you should learn from this. One, how to deal with people who challenge your faith. Right? I think Jesus gives an excellent example, of course he does, of how to answer people who are challenging the faith, and then how to present to them the gospel. And finally, to be even neighbors to your enemies. Ye have heard it, that it hath been said, this is Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, ye have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. He's referring to the schools here. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Amen. Heavenly Father, I come before you, Lord. I thank you, Lord, for this message, Lord. I pray that we'd be able to apply this to our lives, Lord, that we'd see our own insufficiency, that our bare minimum is not our everything that we do is what is necessary, and we can't accomplish that. And the bare minimum is everything. Lord, I thank you for sending your Son to die on the cross and be the everything for us. And I pray all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.